Hello, I'm Jonasz. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia says it has the upper hand in Ukraine, but try telling that to the drivers in Siberia who can't fill up their tanks, or to Crimeans forced back onto Soviet-style fuel coupons. Ukrainian drones are hitting Russia's refineries, disrupting railways and pushing petrol prices to record highs. The Kremlin insists the war has no impact at home. The pump tells a very different story, though. Join us on the journey where we, on this episode, will be talking about the Ukrainian strategy of bringing consequences to Moscow's actions. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Thick black smoke billowing over Russian refineries tells the story more vividly than numbers ever could. In just 3 weeks, Ukrainian drones have disabled nearly 1/7 of Russia's total refining capacity, an indirect strike at the Kremlin's war chest. The attacks came in waves. Novokuybyshesk, Saratov, Volgograd and Samara, each name once meant fuel production, now it signals paralysis. Together, these shutdowns stripped away more than 44 million tons of annual refining capacity. The biggest blow struck Volgograd, one of Russia's top producers. Half the capacity at Rosneft's flagship Ryazan refinery has also been idled since early August, leaving Moscow to grapple with outages it cannot quickly repair. To contain the fallout, the Kremlin imposed a ban on gasoline exports until September. Yet analysts warn the real pressure is not abroad but at home, where shortages loom over transport, factories and the military.
So far, it's a very far cry from a fuel shortage for Russian military effort, and also the nature of military activity these days is such that fuel is probably not the most crucial element in it.
For Ukraine, the drone campaign is more than a tactic. It is strategy. By setting fire to the infrastructure that powers Russia's economy and its war machine, Kyiv is rewriting the map of vulnerability. And so a new front line emerges at the pump.
And now let's zone in on the east-splaining portion of our show. Gasoline prices in Russia have soared to record highs, not because of global oil markets, but because of Ukrainian drone strikes. With key refineries knocked offline, Russians are feeling the cost of the war at the pump. Here is what's behind this latest spike.
On August 18th, the wholesale price of AI-92 gasoline hit about $888 per ton, while AI-95 surged to nearly $1,000. That's a one-day jump of over 2%, and since January, prices have risen by up to 49%. The cause behind the spike is drone attacks that have forced at least 3 major refineries offline this August: Rosneft's sites in Novokuybyshesk and Saratov, and Lukoil's massive Volgograd refinery. These disruptions are choking domestic fuel supply and hitting the economy hard. In regions like occupied Crimea and Russia's Zabaikalsky, AI-95 has disappeared from civilian pumps, or it is rationed by coupons. The Energy Ministry insists there is no crisis, but reports from the ground say otherwise. For Ukraine, these strikes are economic warfare. Kyiv says long-range attacks in 2025 have cost Russia $74 billion, over 4% of its GDP. Oil infrastructure has made up nearly half the targets. With each refinery hit, prices climb higher. For Russia, the battlefield has come home, not only in explosions, but in the soaring cost of a tank of gas.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. While Vladimir Putin insists that his country is financing a war without any strain, the reality is showing up at gas stations across the country. Ukraine, through its drone campaign against Russian oil refineries, has hit at least 4 major refineries since early July. In the past, these strikes were sporadic and repairable. This summer, however, Kyiv has shifted tactics, systematically targeting plants in the same region, leaving them out of service for weeks or even permanently. As a result, by mid-August, at least 10% of Russia's refining capacity was offline. Now, that may not sound like much, but Russia's energy system is the central nervous system of the entire state. Knock out 10% here, disrupt some railway lines there, and suddenly you've got petrol shortages in Crimea, long queues in Siberia, and fuel coupons that bring back memories of the late Soviet Union. Wholesale petrol prices on Russia's most common grade, namely Euro 95, have hit over $1,000. Prices are up 55% since January and 8% since just the beginning of August. The government, terrified of unrest, has stepped in to slow the rise for ordinary drivers by subsidizing oil companies and quietly warning stations not to raise retail prices too sharply. And so the Kremlin faces an uncomfortable contradiction. On the one hand, Putin wants to project an image of absolute control, of a Russia unfazed by Western sanctions, able to finance his war indefinitely. On the other hand, though, the very refineries that turn oil into usable fuel are literally on fire, thanks to Ukraine's drones. And no amount of propaganda can disguise the sight of empty pumps, rationed coupons, and climbing prices. The Kremlin isn't releasing stockpile data anymore. It stopped publishing those numbers last year, citing the risk of market manipulation. But Russians don't need data to know the truth. The shortages are worst in peripheral regions, Zabalkaysky near Mongolia, or Crimea, where the Moscow-appointed governor has already had to admit disruptions. To be clear, this isn't yet a systemic crisis. Russia still has diesel, which the army, transport, and agriculture depend on. Analysts say that unless diesel is disrupted, the state can keep its war machine running. That is little comfort to Russian families, though. It does still mean the Russian military isn't grinding to a halt anytime soon, and for the Russian government that seems to be what matters the most. Now, Moscow may try to minimize the optics, but the message is clear. The war has come home. Ukraine can't win the war with drones alone, but by turning Russia's energy system against itself, it's proving that no amount of battlefield pushes can insulate Moscow from economic reality. The pump simply does not lie. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Rostislav Khotin, Senior Ukraine Editor at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello.
So Ukraine has been trying to strike Russian refineries and related facilities for quite some time, in many cases successfully. How important is it for Ukraine to maintain this strategy, and does it actually bring about tangible results?
I think so, yes. Over the past 3 weeks, I would say, Ukraine has been trying to hit almost daily Russian oil installation, either its oil refineries and also oil depots. The geographical spread in Russian Federation of these Ukrainian strikes is quite wide. Ukraine has been able to strike oil refineries not far from its border with Russia, in Krasnodar region, in Kuban area, in Rostov region, in neighboring regions along the eastern border, but also deep into Russian territory, for instance, Ryazan, or other installation on the Volga River, even, in Tatarstan, in the Russian Autonomous Republic. These strikes are quite successful because every strike with several drones causes like huge fires and smoke, a lot of smoke, black smoke. There are several reasons why Ukraine is doing this. First of all, to Ukraine is trying to strike Russian oil installations to for Russia not to be able to supply petrol and diesel for the armed forces and kerosene for the airplanes. Secondly, it causes quite instability on the Russian internal petrol market because, for instance, ordinary Russians now feel the war. That war is not somewhere in Ukraine, in a remote country, far away land, but it's coming to your house. You are not able to fill the petrol, your car with petrol. For instance, several installations were hit in Crimea, and in Crimea now almost the 895 petrol type of petrol has almost disappeared, especially taking into account the logistical difficulties to bring petrol from the mainland Russia into occupied Crimea. So people can, fill in the petrol tanks of their cars. That's how that's why these Ukrainian strikes against oil refineries and oil depots are very important.
So this is a genuine attempt to cause discomfort both to the Russian general public and to the Russian government, which of course thrives on oil revenues. If the oil revenues are gone, it would be much more difficult to finance the war. Now, obviously, it's not quite as easy as it may seem to damage a facility like that. So can you tell us more about what are the advantages and disadvantages of picking this kind of target? You've already mentioned that sometimes they are located quite some distance away from Ukraine, so you need proper weapons. But also, these are big facilities, right? So you really need to know what to hit in order to make it hurt really badly and not to waste the drones or missiles that you're using for these attacks.
Yeah, first of all, you have to have a proper business, if you want business intelligence, where these oil refineries are located, how are they defended by anti-drone systems or nets, special nets against drones. You have to have the perfect timing to hit them overnight or early in the morning when there are no many employees, workers there, not to avoid civilian casualties, because unlike Russia, Ukraine has no aim to target the Russian civilians. Unlike Russia has the opposite aim in Ukraine, to terrorize population, to hit, to kill as many as possible Ukrainian civilians. So you have to avoid civilian casualties. You have to strike not with just one drone, but for the proper effect, the maximum effect, you have to direct several drones over there and to hit the very production, the depots in the oil refineries, where the oil actually, to cause the maximum fire and maximum, when smoke is rising, it's kind of makes an effect on Russian population.
Precisely. Do you think it can actually be made easier once Ukraine fully introduces its new types of missiles? There were latest reports that, for example, the Flamingo missile could have a range of up to 3,000 kilometers, and also a missile carries a much bigger payload than a drone and moves faster, so it's more difficult to intercept. Could this be a game changer in Ukraine's attempt to cripple the Russian refining industry?
First of all, Ukrainian drones are quite long distance already. For instance, if in Saratov region on the Volga River, Ukraine hits oil refinery, it's quite far away from Ukraine. But now, just before the Alaska talks, Ukraine introduced the newly designed, newly modeled, the Flamingo missile, which will come into mass production, according to President Zelensky, either at the end of December or January, February, maximum, the latest next year, January, February next year. Secondly, this missile is quite powerful. It has a range of about 3,000 kilometers. It can reach Moscow easily. Can reach St. Petersburg easily. It can reach all European Russia easily, and it even can reach Ural Mountains and beyond, into deeply into Siberia, where actually a lot of Russian oil extraction companies are operating. Oil deposits are there, oil installations. Oil pipelines, if you want. military installations as well, airfields and so on and so forth. Because before Russia, when Ukraine started striking Russian territory nearby Russian border, Russia, for instance, moved airplanes, fighter jets away from Ukraine. But now with Flamingo missile, Ukraine can reach them quite far away. Second point I want to make is that Ukraine is reliant on Western-made missiles, but these, when West supplies Ukrainian side with missiles, there are also strings attached. You can't hit Russian territory, or you have a limit of 200 kilometers away from Ukrainian-Russian border. There are a lot of limitations, a lot of strings attached. With Ukrainian-designed missiles, such powerful as this Flamingo, Ukraine has a free hand. It can do whatever it wants. It can strike wherever, whatever, and whenever it wants, deep into Russian territory.
So, of course, Moscow will be trying to achieve its goals before these new technologies become available, because it knows that right now it still has this window of opportunity, unfortunately. Nevertheless, we are in the middle of negotiations on the one hand. On the other hand, we still have Russian society mostly supporting the war. Now, you've already mentioned that drivers across Russia are facing difficulties because of the rising prices of fuel. But with your knowledge of Russian society, could this cause a major crisis? Could this cause unrest? What do you think? Because we know that the availability of petrol, obviously, was one of the most fundamental things for many, and in the course of their jobs, their free time, and all that. But on the other hand, Russian society so far proved to be rather unwilling to engage in any sort of major unrest against the government.
There might be local small protests on a small scale. There might be some unhappiness, frustration on part of the Russian society. This war has been going for quite a long time already, 3.5 years. There might be frustration with the armed forces. Recently I read an article about the mood on the front lines on the Russian side, among Russian soldiers. They don't know what they are fighting for. The mood is quite low. Morale is quite low. The frustration is quite high, but nevertheless, I don't foresee any mass protests in Russia or any shifts in the public mood. It's Russia, especially after more than quarter of a century of Putin's rule. Russian spirit is suppressed. They are under enormous pressure from authorities. All dissidents are either killed or immigrated. Any dissent in Russia will be suppressed immediately by authorities quite harshly. So I don't foresee any sign that Russian society will raise up against the war. But despite enormous frustration and unhappiness that it takes for more than 3.5 years with no visible result for the Russian army, presumably the second powerful army in the world, to deal with Ukraine with no victory in sight.
So very quickly, any pressure on Russia would need to involve the Russian economy in general. Would you say the Russian economy is so reliant on oil revenues that further strikes could actually result in instability?
Yes, I mean, oil industry, oil sector in general is the most important source of revenue for the Russian state budget. If secondary sanctions will be introduced against China, or they are already introduced by the United States against India, if Russia will not be able to export oil, if there will be sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, Russian biggest oil companies, if Ukraine will continue striking Russian oil installations, including oil refineries, and generally causing havoc on the Russian oil market, petrol market, I think that will have effect.
Of course, that is a big if when it comes to sanctions. Some people say that the strikes against refineries are the only really effective sanctions, and some other people would say they are not wrong. Rostislav Khotin was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Security guarantees for Ukraine are taking shape without American boots on the ground. The UK and France are preparing limited troop deployments under a future peace deal.
Around 10 countries, including the UK and France, are ready to send peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of a US brokered plan, Bloomberg reports. While Washington pledges intelligence and logistical support, President Trump insists Europe must lead any ground presence. British Admiral Tony Radakin is expected to confirm that UK forces will protect Ukrainian ports and airspace, but will not engage on the front line. France may do the same. Poland, notably absent from the deployment list, says it is still waiting for clarity before committing to any mission. The proposed force was scaled down from 30,000 to avoid resistance from some EU members. The Kremlin has warned the move risks escalation and a direct conflict with NATO. According to President Zelensky, the security guarantees could be finalized within 10 days.
After that will be membership.
Japan says it's ready to back Western security guarantees for Ukraine. Tokyo's role is growing, quietly but decisively.
Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said his country is prepared to join the security framework for Ukraine under a possible peace deal with Russia. Tokyo, already a signatory to a 10-year pact with Kyiv, is part of the coalition supplying aid and equipment to help fend off Russian aggression. Ishiba stressed his country's commitment to play a meaningful role, weighing its legal constraints and military capacities. Japan will join the UK, France and others on the ground, with US backing through surveillance and air defense.
Chinese electric cars are quietly conquering Georgia's streets. And it's more than just a consumer shift. It is geopolitical.
In Tbilisi, China's BYD vehicles now weave through traffic bearing the slogan "Build Your Dreams." China is fast becoming Georgia's second-largest supplier of electronic vehicles, with imports of Chinese-made cars up nearly 80% this year. EVs still make up a small portion of the market, but demand is surging. Chinese brands are cheaper to run and more affordable than their Western rivals, perfect for Georgia's re-export economy. But the auto boom has a political edge. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze has praised China's governance model, and Georgia's ruling party is deepening ties with Beijing as EU relations soar. In a symbolic twist, BYD's new flagship showroom in Tbilisi now occupies the former headquarters of the pro-Western opposition party.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.